I'm Jordan Castro. I'm the Deputy Director of the Clooney Institute. Thanks again, everyone, for coming. I just wanted to say a couple of things before we get into the first panel real quick. If you want to ask questions during a speaker or a panel, there is a QR code on the back of your name badge and also on the table that you can scan and then just put the question in. And then the illustrious Caleb Holmes will ask them. So that's how you can ask questions. I want to invite the speakers up so I can introduce them. Let's give it a round of applause for the first. That's
good? Yep.
Very like ceremonious, sort of. Anyway. Ben Hunt is the Chief Investment Officer and co-founder of Second Foundation Partners, an independent financial research firm and registered investment advisor, and the author of Epsilon Theory, a newsletter and website that examines markets through the lenses of game theory and history. He has a PhD from Harvard University and was a tenured political science professor and has co-founded 3 technology companies. Jennifer Paxton is a clinical associate professor of history at the Catholic University of America. She's also the director of the University Honors Program. She received her PhD in history from Harvard University, where she also taught and earned a certificate of distinction in teaching. Father Mark Ruzin is a priest of the Orthodox Church of America and a lecturer in liturgical studies at Yale Divinity School and the Yale Institute of Sacred Music. He writes about liturgy, theology, and ecology in Eastern Christianity, and has translated books by Orthodox theologian Sergei Bulgakov from the Russian. Currently, he is working on a book and a series of translations related to Orthodox Action, a group of activist émigrés in Paris between the world wars. He is the rector of Holy Ghost Orthodox Church in Bridgeport, Connecticut. Let's give it up one more time for the gang.
Thanks, Jordan. So let's jump right into it. So we hear a lot of narratives of decline and progress, sometimes in the same day, sometimes in the same breath right now, without necessarily probing what we even mean by things like progress, what narratives are being told, or understanding the history of something like progress and change. There's been a vibe shift, right? We hear about vibe shifts all the time, the Christian vibe shift in Silicon Valley, vibe shifts in the presidential election. They happen very quickly back and forth. We want to get underneath the vibe shift. So my first question to each of you, and I'd like to start with you, Ben, if you don't mind. What are we really talking about? What should we be thinking about when we're thinking about what is substantial change? How is it possible?
Well, I got to tell you, Luke, when you first spoke to me about this conference and topic being change, but to explore change through the, I call it ideas of story and technology, I was like, well, you know, that's been the object of desire of my entire life. So yes, I would love to come to this conference. It's what Alfred Hitchcock called the MacGuffin. You know, that object of desire. For me, has always been to figure out, I'll call it the structure of unstructured data. And, you know, unstructured data is a $10 phrase, but it just means the words. And the structure of unstructured data is story. Now, you know, I've had the ability through different careers to try to explore the structure of unstructured data through technology in a couple of different fields. So starting in academia, where, you know, it was the field of political science of all oxymorons, right? And then in some software companies, and then more recently in the world of markets and finance, which is all narrative, right? Which is all storytelling. And I guess I'd start by saying that I've got kind of 3 observations on this link between storytelling, technology, and how it comes together and change. And the first observation is that I think supposedly it was Tolstoy who said there are only two stories. It wasn't actually Tolstoy, but it's attributed to Tolstoy that there are only two stories. A man goes on a journey, and a stranger comes to town, which is pretty right, actually. But the fact is that it's more than two, but it's a small finite number. The number is 12. The number is 12. There are 12 stories for any field of human thought or endeavor that the human animal can hold in its head at the same time. 12. And this is true if you're looking at Hollywood. There are 12 scripts for rom-coms. Right? There are 12 scripts for police procedurals. It's true in investing. There are 12 scripts for understanding U.S. retail sales. No more, no less. There are 12 scripts. Now, these scripts can change over time. What I'm really excited to explore today is the notion of how stories have told over time, particularly the stories we tell to ourselves, the most important stories. My sense is that some of the old stories are primed for a comeback. These stories wax and wane in ourselves and in society. And so I'm really interested in hearing about the old stories. Old wine in new bottles, I think, is a way of putting it. So that's one observation that I'm really excited about exploring today. The second observation is about technology, which is that as much concern as I think all of us in this room have around, goes under that phrase of AI, call it generative AI technology, large language models and the like. What I've learned over the last 40 years is that these are the first applications that are native to the semantic dimension of understanding, to the dimension of meaning. The first technology that goes beyond word search and really gets into idea discovery. It's a profound development. It is revolutionizing the world. It's revolutionizing us in the way we think. Some maybe for better and often for worse. And that's the other thing I'd like to try to discuss today. Third thing, and then I'll stop. In all my work about the stories that are necessary for positive change, and this is true whether we're talking about politics, markets, sports, and I think ourselves, having a story of safety is the foundation story for human change and development. And that's something I'd like to talk about today as well.
Thank you, Ben. So I'd like to just get each of your frames for the day. And I think we'll get to story and technology, not only in this panel, but throughout the day. So now, Father Mark, what's your frame? What should we be thinking about as we think about this question of how substantial change happens?
Well, in case you couldn't tell, I have a background in theology. When I was asked to present at this conference about metanoia, obviously my first thought went to religious conversion. But not necessarily like conversion in the sense of converting from one religion to another, but what does it mean to convert to God, essentially? What does it mean to convert to reality, the true reality that we call God? And I have been, ever since I started studying theology many years ago, it seems to me that theology is simply a way of seeing reality. It's a way of understanding reality that allows you to find God within reality and to find yourself in the same world as God. And I think that process is a process of conversion. It's a process of coming to know or coming to see yourself and God in the same world and to begin to interact. But that process of conversion is basically a work of the imagination. It involves very deeply a kind of creative faculty within your mind, but also within the community to be able to see itself within a story, within a world. I think of the philosopher Kant. Sorry to bring Kant in right away at 9:30 in the morning, but I think he's really, really right when he talks about what does the process of imagination look like. What you have is basically information, you have data, and you have a knowing subject, you have a structure of mind, and the goal is to get these two things to come together. But where does the magic happen when you get these things to come together? He says it's in the imagination. The imagination is like the wizard behind the screens, behind the veil, who's creating this conjuncture of subject and object. And so if we think of God and God's revelation as something that's actually real, and theology and Christianity and religion says that it is in some sense, you have God out here and you have people here. Where is the magic that happens between people and their approach to God or the approach to the reality that God is inviting them to? It happens in the work of imagination. So a lot of my interest in this panel, as we'll talk about a little bit later, is what is the kind of processes by which the imagination is ignited to begin a process of conversion to God or to reality, to something that's deeper?
Thanks, Father Mark. Yeah, and one of the things I hope we can do is connect the philosophical and theological grounding to practical things like technology, things that we're actually faced with in the world, things that are shaping our imaginations. Thank you. And Jenny, what does a medievalist think about this question?
So thank you so much for inviting me, Luke. I am a medieval historian, and I study the history of monasticism. And my own research focuses on a group of monasteries and the way that they used their own stories to try to position themselves for survival in what we might think of as a competitive market. So they're using their past to tell their story to achieve a goal in the present. And I think that's really what story often is about. So you're hearkening back to the past to do something you need done in the present. But I'm fascinated by what Ben was talking about, but I hope we'll talk about it a lot more, because in the history of monasticism, there are two stories, right? And the two stories are a man hears what the gospel says about going and selling all you have and giving it to the poor, and a group of people decides that they need to live in common like the apostles. And those are two stories that recur over and over in the history of the church. But every time they do, they manifest themselves differently. So every time people think that they are going back to the original narrative, they're actually creating something new. And the reason that I think this is so interesting in our context is because of an essay that Luke gave us all to read in advance of this conference. And I always like I like an assignment, right, that do the reading in advance. And it's an essay by René Girard, which I strongly recommend to anybody who's interested in these topics, and it's called Innovation and Repetition. And so it's about the balance between changing and preserving and copying, right? And how every time you're doing something, you're doing both of those things and trying to balance the two of them. And if you don't get that balance right, you won't have something that both preserves something valuable from the past and also creates something new that's appropriate to the moment in which you find yourself. So that balance, I think, is really what fascinates me.
Thank you, Jenny. I think I don't want to direct this question at anybody in particular, but I want to ask a question about agency now. We live in a world where we use this metaphor from the Matrix about how people can get pilled, right? You take a pill, the blue pill or the red pill, and that's not referring to politics, it's referring to kind of what Father Mark discussed. The blue pill is where you stay in the reality that you know, you operate within its rules, and you take the red pill and you step outside of that, and you see reality for what it is. And there's the black pill, the clear pill, there's probably going to be 3 more colors of pills by next year around this time. But I find that a fascinating metaphor that we've begun to use, a meme that we've begun to use as a culture. Because if you think about a pill, you might make a decision to take one without really knowing what's about to happen to you. This kind of goes back to the vampire story. But then after that, things just happen to you. Just happens to you. And you're not really a participant in the process of change. Sometimes you don't even know what's going to happen. So I find it almost a sign of low agency or something like that. You take a pill and you somehow change your mind about something. see the world a little bit differently, but what's actually happening substantially at the core, at the level of the person. And you said something, Ben, so maybe I will direct this one to you actually first. You said, and correct me if I'm wrong, at one point, narrative is intentional, narrative is motivated, narrative is done to us, narrative is quite rationally embraced by us. So what do you mean by that?
Well, what I mean is that I like talking about the human animal because I think it can be difficult to talk about the biology of our neurology, but I think it's important to. And the human animal sees the world through stories. And I mean that in such a literal sense, right? That our physical ability to perceive and process information is actually quite limited. And so the sensory inputs we have, they make sense to us if we can put them into a story. Now, I love this what you've been describing here about the courage to change or keeping your own mind. I like to talk about is maintaining an autonomy of mind. And that the truth is that our autonomy of mind has always been not under assault. Yes, narrative is intentional, but it's not a bad word, right? We as human beings, we can only make sense of the world through story. And I think the real question for us is, of those dozen scripts that we can hold in our head when we're thinking about something at any point in time, what scripts are running through our head? And there has been an enormous change in the world, I think a negative change, that comes through both technology and through our human practices. Right? And the first and foremost one of that is this little dopamine machine that all of us have here. And as with most profound changes, it's not that somebody has done this to us. It's not the 1984 scenario where there's the screen on the wall that you can't turn off. It's that we willingly adopt a screen that we do not turn off. And so what this allows is the delivery of stories, of scripts, because that's what your pills are. They're scripts. They're very well manufactured, self-referential, but robust scripts for understanding the world. Usually it's used in a political context. So these provides a set of ready-made scripts for us to understand the political world. And we take these scripts in willingly. Right? This machine, I mean, it's the last thing I look at when I go to bed. It's the first thing I look at when I wake up in the morning. Not my wife, my iPhone. Now, how sad and pathetic is that? But it is. And I suspect a lot of people in the room, that is as well. This is the challenge of our lives, right? That to maintain our autonomy of mind, to maintain that agency, as you're describing it, understanding that we're not, I don't want to say free agents ever. I mean we are designed, we need story. But it's what stories are we absorbing, and do we maintain critical distance in the stories that we absorb and the pills that we take? That's the mission. It's never easy, but that's what we got to do.
Clear eyes, full heart.
There you go.
Lose, right?
Can't lose. Right. High school football and life in general. Yep.
That's right. Father Mark, I'd love to maybe bring the theological perspective to this question of agency. In the Gospels, John the Baptist says, "Repent, the kingdom of heaven is at hand," and he actually says, "Metanoia, the kingdom of heaven is at hand." Right? Metanoia. So there's this call to sort of change everything You thought you knew all of the attention you gave to things that don't matter and redirect it to things that do matter. But not everybody who heard those words did it, right? So how should we think about our freedom to choose, the role of agency in the process of change from a theological perspective? And if we can connect it to what Ben is talking about, that would be even better.
Yeah, I mean, I think when you, to get off the phone, you have to want to get off the phone. And the phone makes it so you never want to get off the phone.
Yep.
So whenever you want to change, you want to make substantial change, there has to be an element of desire. There's this, but it's paradoxical, right? Because you're not exactly sure what you want to change into or what new story you want to appropriate. But you have to know enough about it to want it, to desire it. So I think, again, that's where the imagination can come in. Let me give an example from some area of my research that I've been really interested in, which is early Christian literature of conversion. There's, maybe you've heard of this 3rd century theologian named Origen of Alexandria, very speculative, mystical philosopher, theologian. And one of his great works is this incredible commentary on the Old Testament book, the Song of Songs. Now, if you've read the Song of Songs, you know it's a very saucy book. There's a lot of interesting stuff going on in this book. And Origen says in his famous commentary that this book is not for everybody. It's only for the spiritually advanced to read, because if you read it without a sort of sufficient spiritual advancement, you're going to fall. You're going to be seduced, by what's in the book. So he writes this commentary for the spiritually advanced, in which it's basically this beautiful allegory of the bride and the groom are as an allegory between the soul and God. And, from there, we're often running with a lot of medieval commentaries. Bernard of Clairvaux has a beautiful commentary sort of along the same lines. So, but what's interesting about Origen is that he actually breaks his own rule. He says only the spiritually advanced should and can read the Song of Songs and truly understand what's going on in the book. And yet, he also wrote these 2 short, well, there's probably more, but there's 2 surviving ones, homilies on the Song of Songs, which were written for catechumens. These are people who are preparing to enter into the church. They're not even Christians yet. They haven't even been baptized. So how is it that this stern warning that you should not read this book, you should not read Song of Songs, we shouldn't even talk about it until, not only after you're baptized, but after you're at a high level of spiritual maturity, he's also going and talking about it with these baby Christians, people who aren't even baptized yet. And I think it has something to do with this whole question of desire. In the commentary for the advanced, spiritual masters, they have this, they're able to kind of access this almost erotic experience of God through the text. They are given the position of the bride, the entering the bridal chamber and everything that comes with that. But in these short homilies for the beginner, they don't get to embody the bride. They actually get to embody the bride's friends who stand outside the house. They get to literally peek in the window and see what's going on in there, but they're not allowed to enter. And he says, you have to stay outside for now. You're not ready to enter basically into this grand story of God and the soul and the incredible world that is, in this imaginative world that he paints in the commentary. What your job right now is to basically stand outside and imagine what that's going to be like, to peer in through the window, to hear some of the words that are being spoken, to basically elicit a kind of desire from you. I think historically this was a way of keeping their attention. It's we're doing a lot of Bible stories. You can read other early Christian literature of conversion for these catechumens, and it's just like Bible story after Bible story, starting in Genesis and Abraham and all that. And it seems like in the early church, you would be a catechumen, a learner for up to 3 years. So you have to sort of stick with it. So he's like, all right, let me give you a little something from this dangerous book that you're not really supposed to read, but I'm going to let you in a little bit. But I think the function of that, when it comes to agency, is to ignite within the learner, the beginner, a kind of desire to keep going and to realize that the story, hopefully, that they're going to be going into, the change that they're going to make is going to be better. than what it is they deal with now. It's going to be better than the phone, but it's still, you have to elicit some kind of desire to do that and to break free from what it is that the world that you live in currently.
Thanks, Father Mark. You're speaking my language of desire here. I didn't mean for this to turn into a Gerard thing, but it is true. Just the question, what do I want to want, is a really difficult question to answer. And I describe my own process of change as a change of desire. My desires literally changed. There's something probably to be said about the role of mystagogy, right? That was kind of the process of mystagogy, and a mystagogue is literally one who leads others into a mystery. And that's a very different thing than telling people answers or teaching them facts. It's leading into a mystery. And the fact is, what we will become is somewhat of a mystery. I think it's in John even says that, we don't fully know. Then we will only see later what we will become. Jenny, I want to turn to you now. And maybe you could situate us with these questions of progress and change with some historical context. And as you and I were talking about this in the prep, you had mentioned, in the time of Cluny, which I'm obviously partial to, to convert or to change one's life basically meant to become a monk, right?
Because in the period of Cluny, which is the early 10th century, most of Europe is nominally at least Christian. And what that means is going to be different to different individuals, probably different in different places and at different social levels. But really, we only have access to the religious experience of the elite from that time. We don't have a lot of insight into what people in more rural areas or on lesser socioeconomic rungs of the ladder, what they thought about religion. But for the elite, they were at least nominally Christian, and some of them were profoundly Christian. And so when they felt a call to deepen their experience of religion, for them, most of the time, it meant joining a monastic house, so converting to the monastic life. An alternative, though, was for them to become monastic patrons. So that was how you could a little bit have your cake and eat it too. You could sponsor the religious life, but you could stay in the secular world. And so the way that monastic reform took place in the Middle Ages is that marriage between people in the secular world who would pay for it and people who were willing to live it themselves. And that's what you get at Cluny. So you get the partnership between the Duke of Aquitaine in southwestern France, William Duke of Aquitaine, great-great-great-great-grandfather of Eleanor of Aquitaine, if you know who she is, Lion in Winter, and Odo of Cluny. Okay. So this is one of the early saints of Cluny. He's the second abbot, actually, but he's the one who really takes Cluny to the next level. And this is an effort to purify the monastic world of some of the accretions from the secular world that had started to creep in. Because it's very difficult to maintain the monastic life with all of the temptations of the world all around it. And so this had begun to happen by the 10th century. You have a lot of lay involvement in monasteries. So there was a desire to get back to the original spirit of St. Benedict. So again, this is one of these ideas of trying to go back to an origin where they end up creating something new. So St. Benedict had founded a specific kind of monasticism in the 6th century in Italy. Many houses had been inspired by this, including many in France, but Cluny was going to be something that went back to the origin, the original goal of creating this special refuge from the world, but at the same time it was going to be supported by the world because this is an expensive endeavor to keep these monks going. But the thing that becomes distinctive about Cluny, the reason that it's something new, is that it becomes something that is scalable. So other monasteries get founded out of Cluny that follow the same pattern of life with a very strong emphasis on a very strict liturgy, very robust observance of the monastic hours, a lot of intercessory prayer, which is what the lay patrons were really interested in. They wanted someone who was going to pray for their soul. And so why not replicate that model as much as you can? And so in a sense, you get the founding of the first monastic order, where you're going to go from house to house, and wherever you go, it's going to be Cluniac. And there is a structure to this, so these different houses don't have abbots, they have priors. So that is the second in command to the whole Cluniac project, and then they all would be reporting back to the abbot of Cluny. Now, this is an interesting process, the way it unfolds. Not everything about this, I would say, is admirable, because in some cases they're founding brand new monasteries and they're Cluniac from the start. And in other cases, they're showing up at an existing monastery and saying, you're going to be Cluniac now. So there are kind of somewhat hostile takeovers of these monastic houses in which the monks who are there don't particularly want to now follow these stricter rules and spend all that time praying in the choir, but they have to. And so some of the texts about this period give us a really interesting window onto the culture clashes within 10th century monasticism, as you have some sort of old school monks who are liking the old or easier life that they led, and the new style of monasticism. But the result is that by the end of the 11th century, you have this Cluniac project that stretches across Europe, encompasses hundreds of monasteries, and if you are donating to a Cluniac house, you know what you're going to get. You're going to get high-quality intercessory prayer. All of those sins you're committing in the secular world, those are going to be prayed for so that you're going to have a hope of salvation. And as a result, you get this wonderful monastic observance. You have people praying all over the place, and scholarship being done, and a culture being transformed. So it all comes from that initial impulse at one place in southern France, and it founds the concept of the monastic order, which is the basis of so much of medieval religious life, and then down to today.
So it's good to know that power and money were change agents even back then at the founding of Cluny. So,
they absolutely were.
So we don't know anything about that today. I want to spice things up now and maybe turn to Ben or really anybody that wants to weigh in on this question. Let's talk about the role of power and money when it comes to change. We learned recently, I don't know if anybody saw this story, that there's a group of incredibly powerful, influential people on private group chats, having conversations in these mimetic echo chambers and deliberating about very important things. And then all of a sudden you'll log on to Twitter, I'm still going to call it that, and you'll see everybody saying the same thing. And there's sort of been a narrative script, and you get the sense that there's some very powerful forces moving behind the scenes under the assumption that we can actually affect change through our influence. So I think we let's be very practical now, right? We've set up a frame, some of the architecture. We've talked about the philosophical and theological foundations. Ben, this seems to have a lot to do with what you've been talking about in terms of narratives, and I know you've been concerned about this.
Yeah, and concern is a correct word. What I grapple with, though, and I really mean grapple with, is the fact that narrative is not a bad word. That, again, I keep harping on this, but everyone in this room, we make sense of the world through stories. And there's a fractal aspect of that. There's a story we tell ourselves to get up in the morning and do what we do. There's a story element to how we understand politics. There's a story element to how we understand being at this conference. So there are scripts that we operate by. There are narratives for all of this. It's not a bad thing. I think, though, that what I've been struck by is, I mentioned the technology change of the delivery of narrative, a device that we willingly take on so that the message giving, the narrative promotion, is omnipresent for us today to a degree it was not in the past. I'll point out two other really secular, i.e. non-cyclical changes. The first is in the change of our system of media, where we've moved towards 24/7 presentation of narratives, not entertainment, but scripts for how to understand the political and economic world. What I mean by that is, it started with CNN, but now it's the 24/7 news across all sorts of different political vibes. Similarly, in the business world, there's not enough content for 24/7 news. And by the way, so the New York Times, WAPO, all of our instruments of media are now 24/7 always on because we carry a device that allows that to be presented to us. We accept that in, we take it, we want it. Because there's not enough news, what takes the presentation is, I call it fiat news, and it's similar to fiat money. It's made up news. It's opinion presented as news. So 99% of what we absorb through these different channels, and it's a profound change in our entire media system, is the presentation of opinion as fact. There is an organization to that. There is agency behind that. There is A/B testing on all of that. It is everything about our consumption, whether it's consumption of attention, consumption of votes, all of that is, there trillions of dollars spent on this agency behind the presentation of these stories to us. The hardest thing in the world, again, is to maintain critical distance. And what I found is that there's one simple thing you can do, try this one simple trick, right? And that is to always ask yourself, when you're reading something, why am I reading this now? Why is this being presented to me now? Because there is agency behind the presentation of that story to you. I'm not saying it's a lie, it's not. Narratives are not bad things. But the critical thing is to maintain our own autonomy of mind and just asking that simple question, what was the agency that decided now is the time that this story is going to be presented to me? Just asking that can make a world of difference.
Father Mark, what do you think about all this?
Well, I'm take you back to early Christianity. That's the waters that I feel most comfortable swimming in. But when it comes to the question of money and narrative, I think about, there's another early Christian author, maybe you know, John Chrysostom from the 4th century. He became a very powerful bishop of Constantinople, which in the early 5th century was pretty much the major city of the Roman Empire because Rome was falling. So he found himself being almost the most powerful ecclesiastical person in the Christian world at the time. And he was very savvy, actually, about getting influential people to do what he wanted. And what he wanted to do was build hospitals. This is sort of the birth of the hospital, is at this time. Build sort of houses of hospitality, build institutions for caring for the poor. And his entire kind of pastoral agenda for the city of Constantinople was to change it from being basically a late Roman metropolis whose story is focused on things like status, focused on things like legacy, focused on things like the nobility, noble lines of families that were supposed to sort of continue their noble legacy from generation to generation, and basically say, none of that matters. What really matters is something quite different. The most important person in the room, he says, is not the person who's on stage, it's not the person who's sponsoring the event, actually, it is the poor person. Because the poor person, he says, following Matthew 25, is Christ. He will say it very clearly. The poor person that you saw on the way to the building today was God. That's the narrative that he's trying to tell. He's trying to say that's actually the truth of reality that we exist in, is that that person is much more godlike than anybody here that actually has some wealth and status. So it's a little bit of a paradox for him because at the same time, he is a well-connected bishop. He lives in a very practical world. It's very realpolitik at times where he's leveraging his authority, which was very good, which was very high among his congregation, to put to basically pressure people that had wealth to push their money into the narrative that he was telling, which was ultimately to undermine their entire life. But in so doing, he was trying to get them to say, I want you to actually be on this journey with me. Ultimately, my goal for you, rich people, is to divest completely of all your wealth, to completely give your wealth to the project, which is to be able to get to the point where you can find God in the face of the poor. That's the narrative that it really matters. That's the narrative. So on the one hand, it's savvy. It's making use of wealth and resources. On the other hand, it's ultimately undermining all of the structures that created that wealth in the first place.
So is it there's this idea, this kind of Hayekian idea that the ideas, the things that change the culture have to come through what we would call the elites or something, right? And so it sounds like John Chrysostom was an elite. William of Aquitaine was an elite. So do we have to accept the notion that change must pass through the elites, should we? Or should we think differently about that question?
I mean, a lot of his sermons, and there are like 1,000 of them preserved, and there's another 1,000 attributed to him, which are probably not his. But a lot of these sermons are basically preached to the elite. Because, and this is still true today, I think, in church, you don't actually often have the poorest of the poor coming to church every Sunday because they're out surviving. What you have is people who are relatively elite who can have some agency and power in the world. And one of the reasons that John was so popular, and the reason he got this epithet Chrysostom, which means the golden mouth or the golden tongue, was because he had an incredible command of ancient Greco-Roman rhetoric. He was able to basically speak the language of the elite that delighted them, and that sort of they would be clapping during his sermons. He'd be like, "Stop clapping! It's not a show." So I think that again he recognized that to go around the elite, which he did behind the scenes often. He's the sort of person. A little bit, I don't know, to invoke Pope Francis. Pope Francis did a lot of things behind the scenes that he didn't do in public. One of the things that I was most inspired by in the last months of his life is every single day, or at least once a week, he would FaceTime with the Catholic parish in Palestine to ask just how they were doing. And nobody really knew about this until the last days of his life. But this is something he was doing behind the scenes, very much on the side of the poor. So John was the same way, and yet, just like Pope Francis also knew how to do, John was speaking to the elites a lot of the time.
Can I say something about agency? Yes. Because the word agency is related to the word agenda. And I don't know how many of you have heard somebody say, "Oh, well, he has an agenda," or "she has an agenda," as if it's a bad thing. But having an agenda literally means to have a to-do list. But we have to think about what's on that to-do list and what is that person's goal. And to pick up on what Ben said, why are they writing what they're writing? Why are they telling the story that they're telling in the way that they're telling it? And this is my chance to make a plea for the humanities as a very important field of study, because this is where we teach people how to interpret the stories that they are consuming. Really, really important to do that. And that's true whether they are intended as fiction or intended as fact. Because fiction has an agenda, fact has an agenda, or some kind of combination of the two has an agenda. And I do want to sound a hopeful note. So right now we are finding ourselves in a period when famously we seem to be very divided. You watch MSNBC, you watch Fox News, you wonder if you're on the same planet. But there was a period from about the early 16th century down to really into the 19th century when everybody in Europe had an agenda too, and it was either Protestant or Catholic. And everything was written through that lens, practically. Okay? I mean, there's a moment in the Enlightenment where people try to break out of that, but confessional history was the mode of historical writing that most people engaged in, and that is confession as in you belong to the Protestant confession or the Catholic confession. And I would venture to say that fascinating as it is to read those texts and analyze them, they in many cases didn't get us that much closer to the truth because this lens was so distorted by the agenda of the people who were writing it. So that disappeared in the 19th century and hasn't really come back. And we are in a moment that is a little bit similar, I think, in terms of how politics are being written about and how culture is being written about, but it will not always be like that.
See, I got to tell you, I'm not sure. I think it's very different today, and I've got a real. I'm not optimistic, right? And the reason I'm not optimistic is that there was a buffer, a distance between the people, even I'll call it the, bourgeoisie, the somewhat elite, right, and the elite that we are written about in history books. There was a big buffer. Today, that buffer is gone. It's gone, and it's gone because of these things we carry in our pockets all the time. So the union of the very rich and the state. I mean, this is what's happening. This is happening, and there's a word for that. It's not a nice word, but this is what we face today. So and this is not a a politically coded statement that I'm making, right? So let's talk about the not just this administration, the last administration, the use of nudge, the use of trying to. I'm going to use this power of media and telling a story for good. It's a disaster. It's as much an impingement on our autonomy of mind to when our betters tell us no, shake their finger at us and tell us this is how to think. So it's so pervasive today, and it's not. This is not a left-right statement I'm making. This is a power statement I'm making. That I'm really grappling with how do we find that buffer, so that there is a better ending to this story ultimately.
Is there a question of our ability to perceive or sense reality? And, for lack of a better phrase, are people losing their BS detectors or something? Andrew McLuhan's going to talk to us later today about the senses, our sensory perception to be able to know if somebody's speaking the truth. I think technology has completely thrown off that, right? I mean, it used to be you look somebody in the eye when they're speaking to you, and that person's lying, right? And now when everything's mediated to us through technology, it seems like that task is becoming a lot more difficult. People can make claims of change. Kanye West starts rapping about God, has he actually changed or not, right? So I think it's a question worth asking when we're thinking about change, like how do we know when change is real? How do we know when it's fake, or when there are claims? I mean, people can claim anything they want about the change they're going to make or the change that they've undergone. What are some tools, or how might we develop the kind of perception to be able to see?
I'll go first. It's person to person. It's this. It's this. There's no substitute for this. Right? Because I mean, we haven't just kind of gone past the Turing test. We've blown past the Turing test. I mean, there's no distinction between. There is no way to tell if that is another thinking, feeling human being, and more importantly, there's no way to tell if that's a human being that is using you instrumentally, or is conversing with you and treating you as an autonomous human being. But we got to find people who will treat us as autonomous human beings and who insist on being treated the same way.
Does that mean maybe there is going to be a desire or return to some form of embodied communal living?
Well, that's what I'd love to hear, right, about.
I'm pessimistic.
You're pessimistic. Jenny's the only optimist on the panel? What's the connection between ritual and embodied practice and belief and imagination, for instance?
I'm with you, Ben. I think there's no substitute for this. I was talking about imagination and the role of imagination in conversion. One of the dangers of the imagination is you begin to basically construct your own world and there's no getting out of it. It's just completely imaginary and you just make stuff up and you're fed by the narratives that come into your phone, and then you find yourself in one world or another, and it's increasingly difficult to speak to the other world. And I don't know, I'm pretty pessimistic about that, like you. But what I think what real change demands then is for you basically to have encounters that break apart the imaginary world that you've constructed and that force you to reappropriate something new. And I think the best way that happens is basically the face-to-face encounter with another person, especially someone who's different from you, who is not part of your imaginary world all the time. I don't know, I've come back so many times to the French philosopher Emmanuel Levinas, who talks so much about the face of the other as being that which breaks into my world and demands something of me. It places a genuine encounter with another person places me in a state of humility where I need to acknowledge their autonomy. I need to acknowledge that they are in some sense above me in the situation and I need to adjust. So the more we can get those kinds of encounters, I think, which are becoming fewer and fewer because we're much more satisfied to stay within the worlds that have been created for us. The more we can have those encounters with someone who breaks open my world a little bit, the better. I think that's a better recipe for actual change.
Well, let me defend my optimism.
Good, please.
I think one of the reasons I'm optimistic is because I spend a lot of time with students. And many people will complain about students today, but I think they've been complaining about students today since there have been students. They were always more hardworking in the past, knew more, et cetera, than they are now. But I've been teaching a class this semester in the honors program. It has nothing to do with medieval history whatsoever. This is an interdisciplinary capstone seminar. It's a different theme every year. And this year, the theme was human and robot. And we spent a lot of time talking about AI, obviously, but also about the whole question of what makes you a human versus a machine, and why human beings have wanted to create alternate humans for so long. This is a narrative that goes back to at least the classical world, and for a long time people couldn't do it except in their imagination, and now they're starting to be able to, and what does that mean? But what I found is that the students, in the process of learning about the creation of artificial humans, formed an incredibly tight community. I divided them up into two little teams. They competed against each other all semester, and they just had a marvelous, marvelous time being together. 12 students. Yeah. Some of them knew each other going in, others did not know each other very well. But they told me at the last meeting this week that after each class ended, they would stay together and they would continue. Now, I was tired by that point. It was 9:10 p.m. It was my bedtime. But they would hang out after the class because they wanted to be together. And that, I think, is what we have to concentrate on, creating community.
For sure. The challenge is, though, it doesn't scale. Right? It's the maximum number, whatever is that Dunbar number, and I've experienced this too in the kind of the communities that I've been around. It's 100 people, maybe it's 150, I don't know, but it's no more than are in this room right here, and that is the challenge, right? Is creating that. It has to, and it doesn't have to be face to face. I think there's a lot of epistemic communities that you can create. It needs to have some focus for, some ability for human-to-human connection to understand that, yes, you're an autonomous human being, and you're going to treat me that way, and I expect the same in return, but it doesn't scale, right? And on the other hand, we're against, and we really are against, this union of wealth and power, the state and the oligarchy, and their instruments absolutely scale.
I think that the Dunbar number, 150, right? Yeah. That's like the maximum number. I mean, he actually thought that it was like 7 or 8 like really meaningful relationships are what you could actually maintain in the family. I mean, one of the reasons when we talk about Athens, Jerusalem, and Silicon Valley, what are we really talking about? It's not just getting priests in the room with entrepreneurs, with academics. Something much deeper than that. We all have two fundamental drives, I believe. We have simultaneous drives for differentiation and for communion. And when we lean completely into either one of those, bad things can happen. You just dissolve yourself in the party or the group, or you're just the rugged individualist who just is on this journey of differentiation. And in order to simultaneously be in a place where you can live with that tension, you have to be uncomfortable. And you have to have the discomfort of the Thanksgiving family dinner, right, is my best analogy for it.
Right, or the classroom,
Or in the
or the
classroom.
church, or the synagogue. Like these are. I mean, it doesn't scale, but in a sense, it does. It might not scale, but it might replicate.
That's
And
the
I think
trick.
to follow
This is what
Jenny's,
Cluny did.
That's
Yeah,
right.
this is what
Little
Cluny did.
crystals all over that
Exactly.
grow into
Yep.
grow their own thing.
In my experience, which is not very long, as a priest, the most healthy communities usually reach about 150, and then they start another one, right? Because that's where once you get beyond that, things start to get complicated. Money gets involved, power gets involved, personalities. Let's just go start another one, and we can do this over again. And I want to just reiterate your plea for the humanities. I appreciate your optimism, but it is a lot of it's because you spend so much time in the classroom, and you're able to actually have these face-to-face encounters in which you see people's humanity come forward, you see people get excited about ideas and form community. So, more of that, please. Stop cutting those funding sources.
Thank you, Father Mark. Caleb, do we have any questions coming in on the app?
Yeah, we've got some questions. Want to start going over some of them. The first question comes from Brandon V, and it's, does agency or a desire to change necessarily precede substantial change? The conversion of Paul suggests otherwise, and can one experience undesired transformation? Wasn't directed at anyone, so I guess it's
I think
all
that
of you
one's for
guys.
Father Mark.
There are a few questions in there. I'm really interested by the last one. Can one experience undesired transformation? Is that what it was?
Is that how we
Yep.
put it?
I mean, one of the things about conversion, and I see this in religious conversion, especially jumping from one Christian group to another, is that oftentimes you get seduced by an imagined idea of what this other Christian group is going to be like. And after a few years, you realize it's not all that great because human beings are human, and it's kind of it's messy all the time. And so I've seen this many times where people will convert to one faith or another, and then after 3 or 5 or 7 years, they're pretty much burned out because it wasn't really what they imagined, and the kind of change they hoped to make wasn't what they were expecting. And sometimes it's because genuinely that community was unhealthy, and what they thought was good about it turned out to be bad. But sometimes it's that they were not willing to allow themselves to be challenged, that they came into a community thinking it's going to answer all the questions that I have, it's going to align with all the values that I already have, and it challenges those values to the extent that they are not able to, they're not willing to bend to adjust. So I think there is a danger of being malformed because not all communities are actually healthy, and not all your imaginations about them are accurate.
Let me just add something to the undesired question of change. It took me a good 10 years to even have some language to describe my own process of conversion. And the best that I've found comes from Rudolf Otto in his description of the holy. And he describes the holy with a Latin phrase, the mysterium fascinans et tremendum. So it's a mystery that both fascinates and makes us tremble. So there's a paradoxical combination of dread, yet something that's magnetically attractive and almost seduces us. That's how he describes the holy, that pulls us out of ourselves and draws us towards something. The mysterium fascinans et tremendum. And it reminds me of that, right? It's I'm being called out of myself towards something that scares me a little bit. And I would call that maybe an undesired change, right? That one has to somehow, not against our will, right? Not forced on us, but at some point we have to step across the threshold of hope.
All right, our next question, this is aimed more towards Luke. So Luke, you mentioned safety as necessary for change towards the beginning. If a prerequisite for change is someone breaking into and disrupting the story we've constructed, how do we create safe and disruptive communities?
So that was me, right? So I've been thinking about this a lot from a markets perspective, because the biggest issue in markets today is that there's very little risk-taking happening in the real economy. And the corollary of very little risk-taking, I mean, here I'm talking about making an investment, building a factory, hiring people. That's all, it's just stopped. And the corollary of that is that the safe haven for your money has always been U.S. Treasuries, right? That's the safe place. And I strongly believe now, at least in markets, you can't have one without the other. You can't. The biggest reason there is no risk-taking in markets today is that there's concern about the safety of U.S. Treasuries. And so I was thinking about that in terms of our own personal change, that unless you have a safe place, a safe asset, it doesn't give you the foundation to take a risk. Right? The reaction that if we don't find that there's that place of safety, at least in markets, and I'm really like to discuss if that's true elsewhere, if you don't have that place of safety, you don't take risk. I suspect it's the same in our personal lives for change and taking risks. Because everything you're talking about, being a vampire, man, that's taking a big risk. Just jumping into the unknown, I may be wrong, and you may be wrong. But it's a big risk. And I think there's got to be that place of safety before humans take a risk.
It's interesting because don't humans also take some of the biggest risks when their backs are up against the wall, or when they're going through a time of unexpected crisis?
Do they? I mean, is that a risk? Is that a choice? Is that a risk, or is that, well, I got no choice, and so I'm going to do this risky thing? It seems to me that's the difference between doing a risky thing, because you gotta, and choosing to take risk in a positive sense.
Calculated risk.
Yeah,
maybe.
yeah.
Right, in a positive sense. Yeah. Anything to add, Father Mark or Jenny?
Well, I think that some of the narratives of religious conversion do end up focusing on the reluctance of the converted. So getting a call from God that you are reluctant to answer. And this is a trope in saints' lives. It's a trope in miracle stories, the initial reluctance to answer the call. And I mean, that has a narrative function, of course, because it serves to emphasize, right? Because in many cases you have to hear something 3 times. It's like the call of Samuel. But I think
the whole hero's journey.
Yeah,
right?
it is. I don't.
I'm
not going with you to Mos Eisley. If you know, you know. But I think at the same time, that's meant to show us that this wasn't a frivolous choice. It was a choice that had to be embraced in the face of a challenge. And I think that's really important, that if you just lightly embraced a whole new life, how deep would your conversion be? Or would you then be in shallow soil, as the parable says?
Thanks, Jenny. I think we have time for one more question before we go to the break.
All right. Given that we were talking about technology earlier, can technology be a catalyst and facilitator of substantial change? Or is it simply a distraction and obstacle? If it's possible that it could be used for change, how do we amplify it for true conversion?
Can technology be used as a positive force for change? Yeah, that reminds me of the podcaster Lex Friedman, who I think a few years ago, he said he wanted to build a social media platform ordered towards love. Is that possible? Or you don't have to answer that question, but
Look, I'll just say, I'll just say, in our company, we got 100, multiple orders of magnitude, 100 to 200x improvement by rewriting all of our code on AI as an operating system, and I know lots of stories like that. So and the ability to use it from the bottom up is, it's the freaking steam engine, is what it is, for anything to do with words and ideas. It's a steam engine. Right? The challenge is, does it come from the top down? The goal here, and everything I think about technology, is preserving it so that we can have access to a steam engine. If you can do that, absolutely. It is totally transformative for building both communities, wealth, ideas from the bottom up.
We've been through this before with the advent of printing, right? Or with the advent of writing at all.
Exactly.
Right, so the only question, and this is something that we debated in our class this semester quite a bit, is whether the change we're undergoing now in AI is a degree or kind. And I think that's a real open question. This is something that is like some earlier changes we've gone through, but also different, because it has not just the power to disseminate information, but to really analyze it and shape it. And that's something that was not true for the advent of printing or writing, as transformative as those were. So this has the potential to be even more transformative. One of the things that we looked at this semester is the fact that whenever you're looking at robots, you're looking at humans. Wherever we go, there we are. And so any change that we undergo, any technological change, we have to reckon with who we are as human beings and what we're doing with the changes that we're creating. So we're going to get the good, the bad, and the ugly of humanity with the advent of AI. And the amplification of who we are is something that we should really think about.
I think it's so important. Can I just say, it's bigger than the printing press. It's on a par with writing and language. I mean, it is.
yeah, technology is often so poorly defined. We have questions about how is technology changing things. We have a whole panel on this later today, which I'm really looking forward to. But it seems like right now, when we're asking about technology, we're almost asking about AI.
Yes.
It seems like, But the medium is the message. If you're a McLuhan, if you're interested in Marshall McLuhan like I am, and I think there's questions that go far beyond AI that are very important. Praying with a prayer app. How does that change religious experience, for instance? And I think it's going to take us many years to even find out. We often don't know how change has happened until we look in the rearview mirror. It's very difficult. One of the paradoxes of change is that it's really difficult to understand while you're actually going through it. Right?
I think, just to follow up on something Ben said about bottom up, it's one thing to pray with the prayer app. It's another thing to pay for the prayer app.
Yeah. On that note, I want to thank Father Mark, Jenny, Ben. This has been awesome. We have a 30-minute break right now, so we'll see you back in here at 10 o'clock. Thanks so much.